Welcome to the Switch for Good podcast. I'm Alexandra Paul, and I'm here with Dotsie Bausch. Hi, Dotsie.
Hello.
So it's COVID time, and 2020 has been a year where so many people have adopted animals or bought animals for their home because they've been at home. And I'm not sure why, but there's been a lot in the news about how the fact that there's no animals in the shelters to adopt, and that lots of folks are getting animals from breeders.
Yeah, there's so much. I think people have, think they have more time, energy, and can take the effort. I know my vet told me that she is busier than ever with skin conditions, because she said, I think people are home and they're able to observe their pets throughout the day, and they're seeing them itch. And she said, I am absolutely flooded mostly with people coming and going, oh, my dog's itching a lot. It's getting, some of it's food, some of it's, different reasons, but it's just that people are spending the time to observe their fur animals and what might be going on with them. So that's a good thing.
It's a good thing on one hand, that animals are, because you know how I feel. I have very strong feelings about animals being, left alone all day and walked for 10 minutes and then told to go sleep until the next day starts again. So it could be good for a lot of animals. They say cats aren't as happy with their owners being home all the time, but dogs are thrilled. But actually, and it's wonderful that animals are being adopted from the shelters. It's not great that a lot of my neighbors are getting animals from breeders, and I hate it. I hate it. And but anyway, for those of you who think that, oh, it's great that animals are being adopted, there are animals who still need being adopted. And we heard today, Dotsie, about a shelter in Rosarita, Mexico, which is just south of San Diego border. There are 300 dogs that need to be adopted.
Yeah, so that's a shout out. That's a call out to y'all. If you are thinking about, interested in adopting a pet, and there's, I live in Irvine. They have 6 dogs right now, I think, the Irvine shelter. So it really is. They're a lot lighter than they were before COVID, because I know that shelter was at least half full at that period of time. You can go south of the border, because it sounds like there are hundreds of dogs waiting for their human to come save them. So
I'd be so grateful for a wonderful home. So yeah, folks.
And if there's a rescue organization also listening that could really help with the volume, Alexandra and I are here because we live here in Southern California to help with that effort. I think I can speak for you that we would go down and get them if you need our help. So if that is the case, email us at info@switchforgood.org, and we'll put an effort together, and we'll get volunteers, and we'll go take care of it.
Yeah. There's organizations that do help get animals from hard-to-place places to places where people want pets. I remember helping out. They were flying animals all over the country. It was beautiful. And so, yes, people, get in touch with us or get in touch with the Rosarita shelter itself and see the beautiful dogs down there that need a home. And, okay, thank you. It's good to have a platform, isn't it, Dotsie, to do good stuff?
Yes.
Let's talk to somebody today who does really good stuff in her work life. She might not have stood on the Olympic podium, but our guest today has helped many, many athletes get there. Her name is Nanci Guest, and she is a registered dietitian, a personal trainer, an NSCA certified strength and conditioning specialist, and she's worked with professional athletes over many, many countries and many, many disciplines. She was the head dietitian at the 2010 Vancouver Olympics and a nutrition consultant for the Russian Olympians gearing up for the 2014 Sochi Games. She also, and we really want to get into this, she specializes in genetic testing and personalized nutrition. She runs boot camps, and she even consults for food companies like Cliff Bar. So we're in awe of all that Nanci does. And we're really looking forward to talking more about the science that she's involved with and how we can all be better vegans. Hi, Nanci.
Really glad to be here.
I wish that I had met you during my career, but to start off on this whole DNA conversation, in 2010, might have been early 2011, but it was about a year and a half before the games. This field seemed like it was just on the forefront of kind of getting going. So I was training at the U.S. Olympic Training Center in Colorado Springs and had a genetic test. At that point, I was like, they're going to find out that I don't have that much talent. They're going to kick me off the team. I was like really nervous about this DNA test. Like, what are they going to find about me? But a couple of things emerged that were, really didn't change my route to the Olympics or even necessarily how I trained, but it cleared some things up for me that just made more sense. And one of those was it came back that I had a sprinter gene. And my, I had a pretty stereotypical body type for a professional road cyclist, which is what I did for 10 years before I switched over to the track. And switching over to the track required that I build an incredible amount of muscle in my glutes and my hams and my hips, leading into the games to be able to get off the start line, because my sport is from a standing start and we're in fixed gears. So we just have one gear. So you've got to have a big enough gear on that once we get up to speed, we can, travel at 60 kilometers an hour. So that realization and that sort of understanding of how I was able to build those muscles and why I was able to, I'd always really been able to succeed in short distances at the end of long distance events. And it never really made sense because everyone was like, oh, she's endurance, right? Even when I came over the track, her endurance will help the track. But I had that, I do have a sprinter gene. I had that muscle snap that is needed in track cycling. So that just started to make more sense. And it also, quite frankly, it just fueled me with more confidence, right? That I was kind of given this gift and it is in there and that I can do this. The other thing that came back is in the diet part about it, which is, some of the parts that we're going to talk to you about is that.
Well, let me comment on that part first. Just so I know you sound very excited about this, which is great. So I have a lot of good information. So what the research shows actually is that sprinter gene is benefiting endurance athletes because, of course, as an endurance athlete, that's how you're breaking away from the pack. That's how you're getting ahead on the hills, and you need that sprint. So very few endurance athletes, unless you're going 100 kilometers or across Antarctica, you need that anaerobic threshold. And we know sometimes that's even more important, your power genes and your power ability, compared to that endurance or your VO2 max. Of course, you need both, but it's interesting that it's not a full dichotomy like that. So having that power gene we see is highly prevalent in elite endurance athletes. So it's that was, of course, part of what made you so successful.
That's clearing things up even more. I may go back. Maybe go back to it. Maybe I can stand on the Olympic podium at 50. The other thing that it showed was that the diet, that would be best for me, they labeled it as Mediterranean. And by that point, I was plant-based. And so it was, again, just more of a confidence builder at that point because I wasn't planning on changing my diet no matter what that said. That lending towards more fruits, vegetables, nuts, seeds, that type of diet was working for my body. My DNA.
Yeah, I think we need to be cautious because we don't really have robust research that can tell us precisely what type of diet we should follow. We can narrow it down to some of these versions of genes that change the metabolic pathways or modify them. So perhaps we have a certain response to saturated fats or refined grains or sodium, but it gets really complex with dietary patterns. So as you know, in the Mediterranean diet, you can be almost 100% plant-based, or you could be very heavy on the cheese and the meat and the fish, and that you could still classify as a Mediterranean diet, even if you were having still lots of nuts and seeds. And so there's just such wide variability in that. So I think as far as the genes we look at, we really follow very strict criteria on what we would accept as being applicable to give as a recommendation, as an actionable recommendation. So I think the specifics really matter there, because there are a lot of genetic testing outlets out there, and it really is the Wild West, and it's important to sort of rein it in and follow the strong science, which unfortunately in this field, which I'm a part of, I would say about 50% of the tests out there are very poor quality and giving you information that is not backed by evidence nor science.
What you just said, Nancy, is a great segue into understanding what, they were testing my genetics. I mean, I didn't ask a lot of questions, like I said, because I wasn't, I didn't have 10 years ahead of me to learn. I mean, it was like, this was it. And I was like, okay, great. Thanks for the info. So what, and it was, it was a while ago, so sort of new frontier, like you said, but what were they testing in my DNA that gave them this, result that was here nor there from what you're saying necessarily of this sort of type of diet? I mean, what were they really looking at?
So what nutrigenomics is, the field is looking how your genes influence or determine what you should eat. So what the optimal diet is for you, but not so much sort of a wide swath of food, such as a whole dietary pattern, but more so specific nutrients. So what they would be looking at is dietary scores. So they would look at research that if someone had a high score for the Mediterranean diet, they were consuming so many of the list of foods that are high in the so-called Mediterranean diet, which we know varies a lot, even within regions around the Mediterranean. So within that, they're looking at responses to more specific nutrients. So your different vitamins and minerals and your need or your sensitivity towards certain types of fats, if you respond well to monounsaturated fats, if you need to cut back on your saturated fats. So the dietary pattern is a little bit more elusive, but with nutrigenomics, we are looking at very specific pathways as opposed to what we call complex traits, would be your risk of obesity or your risk of cancer, or the thousands of genes that are involved in height, or your VO2 max or strength. We're really bringing it back to just a few genes or a few pathways where we can see that your version of the gene. So remember, we have about 3 billion letter pairs. If you remember from high school biology, A's go with T's and C's go with G's. Those are the nucleotides, or the rungs of that DNA helix, the ladder. And so one of those differences in a letter could be the difference between blue eyes or brown eyes, straight hair or curly hair, or how well you absorb iron, or how well you absorb vitamin D, how well you recycle vitamin C. So it gets very specific. And it's important when you're doing a genetic test that you look at specific recommendations so it can be actionable. So if I tell you right now you have a 60% increased risk of cancer, what are you going to do? The same as the public health recommendations tell you. Eat more fruits and vegetables, don't smoke, don't drink alcohol, exercise. There's not really anything specific that you can take action on. But if I tell you that you're poor at absorbing vitamin D and you should make sure you're supplementing, or you should look at your blood work more often and look at your serum vitamin D, that's very specific information. And so when we offer genetic testing services, as I do with athletes, I'm giving them very specific feedback. And if we look at 75 genes, I can tell them out of those 75, hey, here's a red flag. Let's take action on this. Maybe there's 30 areas which will help them optimize their diet. And so this is really the crux of genetic testing for personalized nutrition. How can I optimize your diet guided by your unique DNA, your unique genetic profile?
Yeah, because my sister, my identical twin sister, took the 23andMe, so I didn't have to take it. But she sent me the results, and I had no idea what to do with it, except for that I was bummed out that I was so white. But other than that, I had got no information that I could actually change anything for the better. My twin sister, who actually drinks coffee, and as you know, Dotsie, I don't drink coffee, but she was so happy about, she was so happy about her test saying that she was a fast metabolizer, because I've been on her a little bit. She doesn't sleep well, and I say, Caroline, why don't you stop the caffeine and see how that is? She's like, no.
She only has it in the morning, right?
Yeah, well, that's what she says. But I say, well, look, you're having trouble sleeping. You're ingesting a stimulant. Why not try and get rid of that stimulant? But no, because she's addicted. And most of you coffee drinkers treat coffee like it's not an addictive substance, like it's just something you enjoy. But y'all are addicted.
I'm fine with that.
So let me unpack some of that. So being a fast metabolizer means that when caffeine passes through your liver, it's being broken down more quickly by the enzyme CYP1A2 is what it's called, and the gene has the same name. So if you have a version of the CYP1A2 gene that makes you a fast metabolizer, you break down coffee more quickly. If you have another version, more slowly, and then yet a third version very slowly. However, that means the caffeine would be circulating in your bloodstream. Whereas with your sister, perhaps, we also have other genes that influence how tightly bound it is to receptors in the brain that caffeine is blocking. So those are called adenosine receptors. Adenosine is a neurotransmitter that's responsible for us feeling very calm. It increases as the day proceeds, and it gets us a little bit more relaxed and sleepy toward the end of the day. So what we can do is we can ingest some caffeine, and that will block those adenosine receptors in our brain and give us the stimulating effect. So the genes that control the tightness of that binding in the brain may be a factor where the brain is being stimulated for longer, even though what's occurring in the body is being broken down more quickly. So if the caffeine is bound to the receptor, it's not going through the liver. It's staying stuck on that receptor and keeping her somewhat stimulated for a longer period. So we sort of need to know more about multiple genes to really give, again, those specific recommendations. And just another factor with caffeine, there's yet another version of a gene where individuals experience feelings of anxiety. So one version of the gene, you're very likely to get anxious and jittery with coffee, and some don't get that feeling at all. And many of us know who we are if we have those negative feelings around consuming coffee. So there's sort of many things at play, and that's why it's really important to get the interpretation of these results from a professional. And unfortunately, most of these genetic tests are direct to consumer off the internet, and we can't be sure that even the company is interpreting the results properly. I've seen much misinformation with that. And people are trying to unravel this and understand it themselves, which is difficult.
Mm-hmm. Is that what you just mentioned, like a fast, medium, slow metabolizer of substances, the same as metabolism, where people feel like, oh, I've got a really slow metabolism, I just can't ever lose weight? Is that the same DNA?
No, and that's where it gets confusing. So metabolism in this sense just means breakdown. So the speed of caffeine breakdown. However, we do have genes, the UCP1 gene, the name doesn't really matter, but that identifies some individuals as having a slower metabolism, meaning they are going to need an even greater caloric deficit to lose body fat compared to someone who naturally has an average or even a higher speed of metabolism. So we do know people that can lose weight more easily than others, and this is a genetic predisposition for sure.
Okay. Okay.
So talk about a little bit about what, for example, Dotsie or other athletes. What are some of the actionable information that you can give them? I know that in your research you've looked at sodium and saturated fat and B12, and can you explain a little more about how your work can help folks?
Sure, absolutely. Well, my specific area in my PhD work was on caffeine. So I recruited 113 male athletes. I wanted to make it 50-50 females, but it does get a little bit more complex with the menstrual cycle. So for simplicity, it just was male athletes. And I put them through a series of tests. So the testing power and strength and anaerobic capacity. And I investigated all of these tests under 3 different conditions. One was placebo, one was a low dose of caffeine, and one was a moderate dose of caffeine. So basically the equivalent of 1.5 cups of coffee versus 3 cups of coffee for the average weight of the individual. For some, it was a little bit different because we did grams per kilogram, which is the most accurate way to assess caffeine needs and intake. And so I identified after the study, after I collected the data, I identified who was a fast metabolizer of caffeine, who was a slow metabolizer, and who was an ultra slow metabolizer. And so what I found was that those who are fast metabolizers of caffeine were significantly faster in the time trial. And so the reasoning behind this is still under investigation. We still need more research, but 50% of the athletes were fast metabolizers, and they on average were faster. Those that were moderately slow metabolizers didn't really have any effect of caffeine. Some were marginally better, some were marginally worse, but overall there was no significant effect. Now, 10% of the athletes are what we identify as or characterize as very slow metabolizers. They actually did worse under caffeine conditions. And when we bring in another gene, what's interesting is that even those that identified as having more energy and feeling stimulated, they actually did worse on caffeine under caffeine conditions than placebo if they had a version of another gene. So what this also tells us, which is of interest, is just because you feel psychologically pumped up and you're in beast mode, it doesn't mean that you're going to physically perform better. So it's really important to understand this and override what maybe your teammates are doing or what your coach tells you, because you don't really have these controlled conditions unless it is a study. And so at the end of the day, what we see as important as contributing to sports science is that genetic testing can help us design supplement protocols for athletes as well as dietary protocols. And then we can touch on what we know about fitness or exercise prescription. But the bulk of the research was the caffeine. And then if you want me to just touch on the B12, the sodium. So a great example for the ineffectiveness of the one size fits all that we get from our dietary guidelines is our need for sodium and how many people should follow those recommendations of reducing sodium or being on a lower sodium diet. So 70% of the population would test positively toward a gene that would identify them as sodium sensitive. And that means that the higher the sodium in their diet, the higher the risk of high blood pressure. However, we have 30% of people that no matter how they fluctuate the sodium in their diet, their blood pressure is not corresponding or correlating with that dietary sodium intake. So therefore, recommendations to that population may be potentially harmful if they're trying to lower sodium and perhaps they're on the lower end of blood pressure. And I say this from personal experience because I actually need to add more sodium to my diet because my blood pressure is so low. And if I started to restrict sodium, I would actually, probably be almost fainting every time I squatted down and got up quickly. So that's a good example of how this general recommendation for everybody does not work. We do need more precision. And another one is the B12. And this, of course, is more of a concern for those following vegan or plant-based diets. And we know that some individuals, whether omnivores or vegetarians, that they are at higher risk for B12 deficiency. And this is with regard to the metabolism absorption of vitamin D. So it's not just a vegan issue when it comes to B12. We see it just as much in the non-vegan population. And then when it comes to saturated fat, which I touched on earlier, but we have several genes which can determine whether an individual should lower their total fat intake, their saturated fat intake, whether they need a higher omega-3 to omega-6 ratio. So we can really sort of unravel a lot of the specific ratios of fats one should have in the diet. And this is something very important for those looking to high animal intake, such as the carnivore diet or the keto diet or paleo or Atkins. I see many athletes that are doing poorly on these diets when they have a very high intake of fat. And it is because these genes are responsible for your ability to lose fat, or where you're putting on fat mass around the middle, or generally your percentage of fat mass. So Dotsie, you would well know that body composition is highly correlated with athletic performance. And basically the leaner you are in most cases, the better you can perform. And so many of my athletes really need to get back to that lower fat diet and higher carbohydrate intake according to their genes. And I'm seeing tremendous success with this. And we know that the atmosphere out there is carbs are evil, carbs are what cause the gain in fat. That's not true for a significant proportion of the population.
Does one have to take a DNA test with an expert like you, or can you just look at us and look at our heritage and take a dietary history and get a lot of information?
We can certainly gain a lot of information, but these genetic tests are pretty easy now. It was more difficult and very expensive, let's say a decade ago. But now I send the saliva collection kit directly to clients, especially during COVID, where they just need to provide about a teaspoon of saliva, spit into a tube, or we also have a cheek swab collection, which is just basically rubbing a Q-tip on the insides of your cheeks for 30 seconds. That's all the DNA I need. So it's very non-invasive, but the level of information that we gather from genetic testing is much more than I can gather through dietary assessment. But it does go hand in hand with looking at blood work. So for example, I have many athletes that need to be more mindful of their blood levels of vitamin D and iron because they are lower due to this genetic risk. And so some athletes, I'm testing their iron 3 times a year as opposed to once a year, and same with vitamin D. So I have to be sort of more on top of that, which we might not know otherwise with a history. And family history does play a role as well. But that really isn't the best indicator, because some of these recommendations based on your genetic profile are very nuanced. So you really wouldn't know for sure if you need more folate. It's not really going to come out as a disease or an outright deficiency, but it might make you just 1% less optimal in making red blood cells. And as you know, Dotsie, especially as an athlete, 0.1% can be the difference between gold and 50th place. So these small you know, decimal places can really impact performance on a grand level when it comes to higher performing athletes.
Yeah, we beat Australia by 8/100ths of a second to take us to the gold medal match. So that's
right.
Just that.
Exactly.
That's, highlighting your point. And so that brings me to what are some of the maybe most surprising, maybe not to you, but most surprising to our listeners, changes that you've seen when athletes have been eating a certain way, whatever certain way that might be, and then they get their genetic test and they start on a new journey. What are some of the biggest changes that you've seen in their output, in their performance, or in their repair, which obviously is wrapped into performance to be able to train harder every day?
I can say anecdotally, of course, it would be great for us to run studies on this to actually have very specific biomarkers and performance outcomes that we measure. But anecdotally, I have done these genetic tests with over 500 athletes, from professional to actually child athletes. And a couple of things I'm seeing. One is definitely those athletes that have the fear of sugar and carbohydrates and are trying to go low carb, and I convince them that they can get leaner without doing that, and they are so happy to get back to carbs. And again, this sort of gets us into the plant-based, and they're happy to know that they can actually stay lean, get leaner, and have more energy and perform better without that restriction of carbohydrate. Another area I'm seeing, although we don't have any strong science for prescribing training, we do have one gene that measures your risk of muscle damage. And so I do see now probably about 10 athletes that are giving themselves a bit more recovery time due to their genetic risk of having higher muscle damage after an intense training session, where in the past or prior to the genetic test, they were forcing themselves to just sort of endure it and endure the fatigue or the pain and get right back out there the next day. Whereas now they're being kinder to their body, nourishing it with antioxidants, frequent protein intake throughout the day, and having that extra rest day, and seeing rest day as being just as important as a training day for progress, which I'm speaking to the converted. So,
no, we love to hear that.
Those are two areas.
I've seen so many athletes just never even make it anywhere near their potential because they were just chronically overtrained and their body was overstressed, and it was just in an oxidative state. They just never got out of it.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Exercise-induced free radical production.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yes.
There are people that we've all heard who said, yeah, I tried going vegan, but I just didn't feel good. I'm supposed to eat meat. Mm-hmm. Can you talk to us? Is that true through your DNA? Is that, are there some people that just won't do well on a plant-based diet? Or is it that they're not eating a healthy plant-based diet?
Well, what frustrates me about these comments is we have such wide variability in a plant-based diet. So is this a vegan diet that's Doritos and Coke, or is this a vegan diet that's filled with many different sources of plant proteins and has we have 10,000 edible plants here on Earth, right? And if we look at the sources of animal products, people generally eat about 5 different animal types, your chicken, your beef, your eggs, your yogurt, your milk, so we don't even come near to the variety that we can accomplish. I think that anyone under my supervision, the worst case scenario that I've seen is it took one individual a good 6 weeks to really adapt to having lentils and beans and the legumes that were causing gas. And I said, just, hold out, wait it out, be patient. And we were successful, and there's been no problem over the past year or so with that certain athlete. I don't know of any genetic variation that would mean that you require meat. That doesn't make sense. That's sort of not how these genetic variants work. So I think that we can offer trial and error on the basis of trying more things and more different foods and more sources of your nutrients rather than giving up, because there's just an endless number of meals and recipes and sort of the variety that you can choose on a vegan diet. So there's not just one way. And so I think that's what's important. And you're right. I don't think people have given it long enough when they give up and add meat back. And then taste is the factor. So that's the only one thing that we can't argue. Those of us who are promoting plant-based diets and veganism is I have a rebuttal to every possible scenario out there, but we can't argue with taste because taste is subjective. But that is the one and only thing that I cannot respond to an omnivore and say, listen, you're wrong, it doesn't taste good. But of course now with our the introduction of the food technology around meat substitutes and lab-grown meat.
As you have traversed this world, I don't know much about your story in the beginning of how you came over to whole food plant-based eating.
Yeah, well, what's interesting is I went to school initially to be a vet. And so in the field trips after my third year of taking my animal science, agricultural science degree, I was exposed to many livestock operations, and in a way that we were meant to see what was going on. So there was nothing that was distasteful or harmful to the animals. This, of course, is where dozens of students are coming, and they're happy to show us how things operate. Even under the best conditions, I felt very upset the way the animals were treated and how they were a commodity. And actually, that was many years ago now, in the mid-1990s, and that was the day that I stopped eating all animal flesh. And that actually coincided with some lab work we did in the animal physiology lab. And one day we were doing the dissections, studying the gastrointestinal tract. And I put my gloves on and I put my hand in, which was just sort of a pile of intestines, and it was warm. And what I came to the realization that that morning, this was an alive pig, that these intestines were brought from the slaughterhouse for us to dissect and to learn from. And that morning, what I have my hand inside was a someone. And it just really, it hit me like a ton of bricks that this was somebody who wanted to live. And I'm a real animal advocate, and I actually have just purchased a farm north of Toronto where I'm going to have a sanctuary and rescue livestock along with dogs. And as you were talking earlier, I want to chime in about the dogs and COVID. And what's unfortunate is the puppy mills overseas. And in Toronto, we have thousands of dogs coming in under terrible conditions and due to the demand. So we really need to stop or control the sources of where these puppies are coming from. And there's some individuals where there's legal action occurring right now with the import of these puppies that are bringing diseases and that are sick. And it really is sad. So that's a whole other podcast. But I just want to add that. I mean, I feel very grateful that I have a platform now, and I've built credibility. And now my platform, and I guess my legacy, is about teaching the world how they can adopt a plant-based diet successfully, and they can thrive no matter what their goals are. Olympic athlete to just feeling great playing with your grandchildren, and across all subsets of the population, no matter what socioeconomic status, no matter what age. So I'm really grateful that people are listening, and I'm able to do that and speak at conferences and on podcasts and actually live it up at the farm life, which I'm going to be adopting in the next couple of years.
I love your ethical basis, but the fact as a as a scientist and as a professional, you stay very, very evidence based. And there's been a long-standing discussion, I won't even really call it an argument, but that cheese has an addictive quality, that there's a casomorphine, and I don't think anyone would argue that there is something in there that makes a baby want to latch again back to their mother, and we all know the drunk baby look in many species. But you said that the science just is not strong enough to support the fact that cheese is addictive, and I want to dive into that. I want to understand it. I want to understand
Sure.
the science behind it.
Well, addictive is a very strong word. And those of us who are studying food and nutrition from a scientific basis, and we have to keep our biases and our ethics sort of to the side. I don't think science and ethics have to be mutually exclusive. But as far as the cheese, that was based on one study that was surveying I think about 100 university students, and sort of asking them about their foods and sort of their drive to eat certain foods. So it wasn't really a study, a mechanistic study, which we could see that there are certain chemicals in cheese that have drug-like effects in the brain, and that we have done this randomized control trial where we gave one group fake cheese, we gave the other real cheese, we tried to cut back on the availability of it, and we could see through functional MRIs the changes in the brain. I mean, we would really have to do extensive research for this cause and effect, but taste can be something that's very palatable, and we get pleasure from the taste, can be something that we're driven to seek out, but addictive is quite a strong word. And when it comes to the feel-good substances in the brain that we release, many of us get that off of exercise or sex or other foods, chocolate, alcohol. I mean, so there are many things that can give us pleasure in the brain, and singling out cheese, I don't think has the scientific basis behind it. Although anecdotally, we can say most vegans say cheese is the hardest thing to give up. It's that one last thing. So I believe there is some merit to it, but I would just be cautious with the word addictive. Okay. And I have to be a messenger of the science, and I'm very careful to not override my love for animals or even protecting the planet, for that to get in the way of the science of nutrition. And that's where it becomes a bit of a slippery slope. And I almost on a daily basis have battles with vegans as well as omnivores about the science, because usually the answer is somewhere in the middle. But veganism, as you know, is about far more than just nutrition. And that's very important to recognize. And it's not just about the plant-based diet. There are many other factors that bring up ethical concerns, and even beyond the welfare of animals.
Right. Well, maybe we could just call cheese just it's like a high intensity food, like sex, like exercise. Like there's something there, but it's not addictive. But because you're so right. People are like, don't take away my cheese. Like they really will fight you for it. So
it'd be interesting to see if when plant-based cheeses get very, very close to the taste, and some of them do, but to more cheeses, if people have a hard time giving up the animal cheese.
Yeah, good point.
If you have a good control.
Yeah.
Yes.
But I do know from experience, not my own personal, because sugar's my thing, right, Dotsie? But cheese is one thing people just hang on to. And there's also the salt and the fat.
Totally. Right, of course.
But, but it's
Lots
different with
of
cheese. You just see this look in people's face when you talk about cheese. They get very, very proprietary over their dairy cheese.
I still miss Manchego I'm just going to admit it right now on the show. Very much. Every night.
Well, with a little bit of knowledge, I think people quite hastily will make the change. And I was vegetarian for 25 years. I was vegan for about 1 year. About 5 years ago, I found it difficult. I went back to yogurt and fish, and I've been fully vegan now and forever going forward for almost a year. And I really needed to see more of what was occurring in dairy. I mean, I sort of knew vaguely what was going on, but to the degree, it's very distressing. And to just know the research behind it and the stress of the mama cow and the baby, and the separation of mother and baby is very similar across species. So humans to cows to dolphins to dogs, that separation creates the same level of stress hormones. And to me, it's just not fair. They're sentient beings that deserve to have that relationship, and it's devastating. And I
You're a registered dietitian, but it sounds like you have given up dairy for ethical reasons and not for health reasons.
I would say a combination. I still. There is some science to show, I mean, on a personal level, I would say something even with skin. And the difference when I would consume a lot of dairy versus times where I wouldn't be consuming much dairy. And I was trying to determine what was it in my diet that was affecting my skin. And I sort of ruled out the times where it be hormonal or stress. And I did see that association to dairy. And we do have some science on that. And certainly we have thousands and thousands of anecdotal reports about dairy and complexion. So there's that as far as the science goes. And then there is some support for hormonal cancers. And so that's very important. So the breast cancer, the prostate cancer, and I am aware on that end as well for health. But also, I think health is more than what you're putting into your body. Health means the antibiotic overuse in the livestock industry. It's the pollution. It's the filling of about 1 million swimming pools a day of manure. That we just can't get rid of. We can't use that for fertilizer of other plant crops. It's toxic. There's 400 toxins in manure, and ammonia being one of the one of the main ones that's causing health issues in not only people that live close to livestock farms, but even in neighboring cities. So we have these toxins that are traveling through water, through soil, and through the air. And similarly, we have antibiotic residues that are traveling through the water, through the soil, and through the air. And this is unacceptable for health on a larger scale, and something we don't have control over. I don't have control over stopping that from entering my body. And we also have health of climate change. So those individuals that are suffering from floods or fires, the loss of biodiversity, this greatly impacts health. If you lose your home, that affects your health. If you all of a sudden find yourself in poverty and unable to feed yourself because of these climate disasters and these severe weather patterns, that's about health. And the exposure with floods to dirty water and the disease that can carry, that's about health. So limiting health to saying, well, I need meat or dairy to get my calcium or my protein or my iron, health with regard to animal consumption is much more far-reaching than just what we're ingesting.
Very good point. Well, speaking of cattle and the effects that they have on human health, can you talk about regenerative farming, what it is and what your thoughts are on this?
And why you're passionate about it, because this is, didn't start out as your field of expertise, but you've certainly become one.
Yes, so regenerative farming certainly is very topical. We have documentaries, we have books, we have blog posts, we have social media, and I think there are a few things to clarify. And again, this is not my area that I study, but I do have a strong foundation because I do have a degree in agricultural science. I took many forestry and silviculture courses, and of course, I learned a lot about livestock production, including trips to Africa and looking at their cattle grazing and how damaging that was to the land. So there was many scientists and many people going across to Africa. This is, well, still it's occurring, but this was about 25 years ago, and really teaching farmers about grazing and rotating the grazing, and how overgrazing was causing desertification. So if you are creating this land that's basically a desert, you can't get that back. That's destroyed for good. And of course, we have this in many countries, the problem with the overgrazing. So regenerative agriculture or grazing, that actually looks positive at face value, because of course we could be doing better with our cattle grazing practices. But one thing that this initiative doesn't really come out and say at the beginning is we need to reduce meat consumption across the board. It doesn't matter what kind of grazing you're doing, what kind of animal production, the world cannot sustain the demand for meat as it is right now. So that's the first is, sure, we can have better practices and maybe we can make our production more efficient and less damaging to the planet, but we still need to cut back a lot. And when we have a growing middle class in countries like China, there's huge demand for beef. And this is one of the main reasons for deforestation in the Amazon. And when it comes to deforestation, not only is that sequestering carbon to the maximal degree, so forests are the largest carbon sinks. And what that means is that the carbon production that is causing climate change and is damaging certain environments can take that out of the atmosphere more efficiently. So the top of this hierarchy would be tropical forests, and then you have boreal forests or other types of forests, and you have wild grasslands. And really what comes last as far as sort of natural lands would be these rangelands and these cattle grazing lands. So although these are perhaps better for the land than monocrops that are not doing any crop rotation, that could be true. You're adding some nutrients back into the land. But if we look at the net effect, these cattle are still producing methane. So the net loss or sequestering of carbon still is not overriding the carbon that's being produced. So the notion that cattle grazing can actually be good for climate change is not true. That's incorrect. Perhaps the type of cattle production can be less damaging, but certainly it's not neutral, and nor is it negative, meaning that it's positive for climate change. So there's and then when it comes to monocrops, which is one of their biggest arguments, we have far more plant crops grown for livestock feed than we do for human plant crops. Mm-hmm. So out of the arable land that we have on planet Earth, about 77% of the agricultural land is used for livestock production. So that would be cattle grazing land, as well as land used to grow soy and corn and grains to feed livestock. And then we have 30-something% that is growing food for human consumption, plant crops. So right there, that gives you an idea of how much land is needed for that livestock. And that is not sustainable. And furthermore, they also argue that it's the transport which is more problematic with fossil fuels. I'll give you a great example, and this comes from Hannah Ritchie, a data scientist out of Oxford, and there's a great site called Our World in Data, and they have shown that about 95% of the carbon emissions in beef production is from the actual production process, where less than 5% is about the transport. Even if you transported your beef from the UK to New Zealand, that would still be less than 5% of the carbon emissions. So those that say, well, I eat local and I eat this grass-fed beef just in the neighboring city or even just down the street, that still is also misleading. And that's part of that regenerative farming argument. Also the return on investment. So for example, for beef production, you need about 35 kilograms of energy that will return 1 kilogram of beef. Whereas if we look to chickens, and not that, I mean, animal welfare and animal rights is another issue, but if we're looking at really the effects to climate change, 1 kilogram of chicken could be produced from about 3 kilograms of input or energy. And this includes the water use as well. And when we grow plant crops, it's almost 1-to-1. And so the difference of what you get back from a plant crop is a much higher return on investment. And another thing that is not addressed with regenerative farming is global food security. So we have close to 1 billion people that are not food secure, or they're starving. So people are dying by the millions. And this is worse with climate change and with droughts, and also with food distribution because of COVID. But we also have that a direct influence of the production of meat and the land required for the production of meat, including cattle grazing and the crops to feed the cattle. So whether they're grazing on grass or you're growing grain for them, all of it is causing or requiring masses of energy and water and creating pollution and, of course, these carbon emissions. But furthermore, it's changing the land use, so we can't grow plant crops that could directly feed humans. And we can't transport beef to Africa, but we can certainly transport grains. We can transport soy and corn and wheat. And actually guess what the number one source of protein on this planet is?
Soy, I would guess.
It's actually wheat.
Okay.
And yeah, and so here we are, so anti-grain in the West, and most of the planet is getting their protein from wheat. And that is something, of course, that we can transport very easily as a non-perishable grain that could reach tens of millions of people. So there are many things that aren't addressed in regenerative farming. And just if we look specifically to the US, we would need 270% more land to meet the current beef demand if we were to have all of our factory farms turned into grass feed operations.
That's always my main question with it, is where are we going to put them all? There's a reason we have factory farming, and the reason that we confine and contain them in tight quarters, right? If we just let them all out, there was no, and especially once we have 10, 11, 12 billion people on the planet, right, Alexandra?
Yes, you're so right, Dotsie.
Exactly.
Question though, as a neophyte in this area, I don't really understand what regenerative farming is. I totally understand that what you're saying is you're basically saying you can't have a solution that entails the problem, which is cattle, no matter how you treat them or how they are on this planet. But can you tell us what the idea is of regenerative farming in the first place?
So the regenerative farming is about using land in a way that you can graze one area and then allow that area to grow back up. But it is basically allowing the cattle to get all their nutrients from the grass on the land, and some of this is recycled back into the earth because through their manure and through other species living on the grassland. But what's misleading about that is that it's not a wild grassland. So you'll never have the same biodiversity as you would with birds and insects and rodents from a wild grassland, because the grazed is just a very different type of vegetation, and you're not getting all this long grass where the birds could hide or where the rodents can hide. So it's regeneration of the land in a way that allows it to take up more carbon from the atmosphere. But again, there's that hierarchy going from the tropical forest downward.
Mm-hmm. And he describes it to me as bringing the land back to the way it was like before human beings were here. So how like you said, how the land regenerated itself when it was wild animals, wild buffalo, stomping across the land, and bringing it back to that.
I'm
place.
all about that. And so let's just get the wild buffalo back, not the domesticated cows.
Out.
Humans out.
Right.
So yeah, but no, this regenerative farming, it sounds like trying to make something sound good, but ultimately it's not going to work, because how long are they really going to keep cows off a certain plot of land if it costs too much to feed them somewhere else? And you're right, where's the land?
It's a bit of it's certainly a bit of a stopgap, and that is also how he described it to me. He's of the belief that there's is no possibility that we're going to be able to move to a vegan world.
Oh,
so this is
this is a stopgap. He's so right about that.
He's pretty. The admission is that it's the better of the worse.
Oh,
yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Well, I definitely think that Nanci's arguments are very powerful, and you're going to do great in this documentary. If he keeps you in, he might not. He might cut you out because you're too good.
I was just going to add, there's also different definitions if you look to those that are pro-regenerative agriculture and those that are opposing it. So I think describing farming and grazing practices that, among other benefits, reverse climate change, which you know what side that's coming from, by rebuilding soil organic matter and restoring degraded soil biodiversity, resulting in both carbon drawdown, improving the water cycle. So this affecting rain and local water. Mm-hmm. So we certainly cannot reverse climate change through having our cattle grazing as opposed to being in the factory farms. And unfortunately, when it comes to climate, factory farms are actually much more efficient and cause less carbon emissions, but then that becomes an animal welfare issue, and that's not acceptable either.
Wait, less carbon emissions? I would argue with that. The fact that they're fed a grain, I've heard grain and not grass, and grain is not natural to them, causes them to have more digestive issues and more methane to be released into the air, and it also allows so many more animals to be raised at the same time, which causes more overall emissions.
Right, but if all those animals were on grass, even if we looked at an increase in methane production, it's not considering land use change. So you can process many more cattle. And so that's where the difference becomes. Are you changing this land from wilderness or forest or wild grasslands? So the other initiative would be to rewild these lands to get back that biodiversity. And biodiversity is also something that is required for our health. We don't know how much we can damage before really many systems can just completely shut down. And when it comes to mental health, which is another whole area, of course, is the depression, or we even have eco-anxiety. People really worried about climate change and the loss of species. And we have mass extinction occurring right now. So I believe in 2019, we had 100,000 species go extinct. Now, many people don't care if it's insects or bacteria or fungi or different types of ferns. It's only going to be we create emotion and public outcry when it's something like a polar bear or a zebra or a type of elephant. So I think we need to understand that ecosystems are very complex, and those insects and those birds and right up the food chain, it affects everything. Everything is interrelated.
Nanci, thank you so much.
Oh,
You're
this is
such
so
a
good.
terrific mix of heart and fact, science and empathy. It's a beautiful, just a beautiful mix to have in one person. You're an amazing spokesperson for the planet and for good science. So thank you so much for sharing all that.
I love and unapologetic about it. They can coexist. They can. And you are the beautiful example of that.
Thank you so much, Nanci.
Thanks for having me. It was really fun.
For tuning in today. If we helped you in any way, then click the subscribe button and let's keep hanging out together. We have so much more to share with you.
And if you need more information on actually making the switch for good, please visit us at switchforgood.org for loads of info. And you can subscribe to our mailing list where you will receive all sorts of super cool gifts, discount codes to our very fave dairy-free products, and a lifetime of powerful health tips.
So join us on the journey to switch for good. This is the future.